low level right from the beginning. And I'm stating this point here, and I'll come back to that, which is that when we talk about the low levels of female labor force participation, we forget that there are actually very important social group differences within it. So not all women have low labor force participation rates. So scheduled caste and scheduled tribe women have always had higher labor force participation rates, and there are, quote unquote, cultural reasons to explain why that is the case. Upper caste women have, traditionally had lower labor force participation rates. Why does this matter? I'm going to come back to that in a little bit later. The decline story, if you believe NSS data, started in 2004. So the bulk of the labor force decline is between 2004 and 2017-18, right? And the decline only shows up in rural numbers. Urban numbers are low and are persistently low, but there's hardly any change. It's about 18-19%. Rural is the one that's shown a sharp decline. So these are factors that we need to keep at the back of our heads as we proceed. And the first paper that I want to talk about, which is not the dropping out paper, is the paper that explores the factors behind the decline. And we first start by looking at the contribution of supply side factors. Because if you're looking at a decline that happened between 2004-05 and 17-18, a lot has changed in India in between. People in general are more educated, women are more educated, incomes have been rising, etc., right? So there have been supply side changes that would explain some of the decline, and we just want to see how much that is. And we look at, women in higher education, income effect, etc., etc. But another thing has happened over this period, which is a structural shift in the pattern of employment. So proportion of people that agriculture employs has declined, share of employment in services has increased, and manufacturing has more or less remained the same. It's been a slight increase, but not really changed much. So proportion of people employed in agriculture has gone down, proportion of people employed in services has gone up, manufacturing. And so, is there any connection between this and the decline? So that's really the question that we are asking in this paper. Here's a graph that shows that pattern. So we've used NSS data, EUS as well as PLFS, and look at the blue line, which is the rural female labor force participation rate, and you see the sort of sharp decline during the period that I talked about, right? And now, juxtapose that graph with the share of, different sectors in total employment. And you see that there, if you look at the red line, which is agriculture, and if you look at the blue line, which is female labor force participation rates, they almost run parallel. So as the share of total employment in agriculture went down, that period and that trend coincides completely almost with decline in female labor force participation rate. This is different from the level story. So this is only the decline story, right? So we wanted to see why is it that these two lines are parallel, and what does it tell us about the changing nature of labor demand, and how that affects women. So we tried to put together data from the National Sample Survey, Employment and Employment Surveys, PLFS, etc., economic census, because we want to look at non-agricultural industries as well. And we created a panel of 571 districts. I'm sorry to be a little nerdy, but I just want people to understand what went into this paper. And I'm going to have some result slides which I'll skip over. So those who are interested, don't blink. So basically what we've looked at is we've looked at 27 industry classifications, which are standard, using a system of classification called the CLEMS, adopted by the CLEMS data system. And here are, for example, some numbers. Mean labor force participation rate in our 571 districts, which is where we could create a panel, was about 46.5. It went down in 2004-05. It went down to 33.5 in 11-12, and further to 24.2 in 17-18. And if you look at education levels of women around over the same period, you see that proportion of illiterate women has gone down, and the proportion of better educated, so the two ends of the spectrum, you see overall that women are getting more educated, which is one of the popular explanations given for the decline, right? So To what extent do changes in the supply side characteristics of women explain the decline, right? And there are techniques to do that. You sort of decompose the decline and attribute it to different factors, et cetera, et cetera. Look at the red line which says proportion explained. So that is the line that tells you, that those numbers tell you to what proportion of the decline are explained by the changes in women's own characteristics. In other words, the fact that they are better educated, their families are getting richer, et cetera, right? Number of children, and so on. As you know, fertility rates have also declined over the period. And you see that between 11, 12, and 17, 18, only 4.5% of the decline is explained by changes in supply-side characteristics. So this is not to deny that supply-side characteristics have changed, but the contribution of supply-side characteristics has declined over time. So we really have to look at other explanations. Okay? Now, here are those 27 sectors of industry sectors that I talked about. The top line is agriculture. The reason that, we begin at 70% because I can't read the first year, 1980. So in 1980, it was 70% of employment was in agriculture, and you see that it's progressively gone down. You see some movement in construction, etc., and services, but not really a whole lot. So agriculture still remains the largest sector, but the relative contribution has gone down. So this is the fact that we want to look at. Okay, now here is the same story told in a different way with three sectors, and you have to read the graph backwards, which is that the high level is the earlier year, and as you go over time, you go towards the bottom left corner of the graph. So anyway, this is just the same story told in many different ways, right? Now, elsewhere in the world, as this kind of structural change, India is not unique in having this kind of a structural change. Elsewhere in the world, this kind of structural change in the pattern of employment has benefited women's employment because skilled labor, the chances that skilled labor gets employed increase as economies transform structurally. Women's education level and skill levels have gone up over time. The change in the content of jobs increases, the brawn over brain, ratio changes. All of these factors elsewhere in the world have favored women, but not in India, right? And so that's really what we examine in this paper. And, again, more papers, more numbers, etc. Now, one of the issues about examining any demand side factor is how do you measure labor demand? Because all the data that you have is employment, which is a product of supply and demand. And so the real challenge in all of these papers is how do you measure labor demand? And in fact, there is what economists call an instrumental variable, which looks at what the labor demand would have been if the share, so you look at the share at an initial period, and you look at the shift over time, and then you combine the two in create an instrument called a shift share instrument, and then you can use that to look at changes in demand. So, this is the instrument, etc., etc. This is our main result using those instruments. And so, what you want to look at is you proxy the labor demand in a particular district by the changes in demand in all districts other than that particular districts, because there could be some peculiar factor going on in that district, etc. So you do all this, and you find that if the labor demand had been the same as it was in 1980, or whichever, these results are for 3 periods of time, 2004-5, 2011-12, and 17-18. So if labor demand had been the same as it was in 2004-5, female labor force participation rate would have been 3.5 percentage points higher than it is today, right? This is what this is showing. So obviously the remedy of that is not, prescription is not go back to agriculture, but to say that in fact, if there had been rural employment opportunities available, then that would have actually increased female labor force participation rates. Well, you could say fine, but then that would increase male labor force participation rates as well. So why is this a story about female employment? And you see here that the same estimation, male employment is far less responsive to that. So what we are saying is that the reduction in the share of agriculture and the increase in the share of services has disproportionately negatively impacted women's employment relative to men's, because you don't see the same results for men. Then we check, is it a particular state driving it? Is it a particular industry driving it, et cetera, et cetera? And we do heterogeneity and all of that. And so we don't really find that there's anything, one particular state or one particular industry that's driving this result. It is a story about labor demand, right? Now, low level, people have talked about cultural norms, women's fear of sexual violence outside the home, et cetera, et cetera. But NSS used to have a module, I don't know if the PLFS has it or not, where they would ask women, would you be willing to work if work was made available either near or in your home? And the majority of women would answer yes to this question. Why is near the home an issue? Because in the cultural norm that really matters, according to my co-author Naila Kabir and me, the norm that really matters is the very high demand of what women call reproductive labor, which is domestic chores, taking care of children, cooking, cleaning, house maintenance, and all of that. This is the real norm in South Asia that needs to shift. And so the question is, of course, what will shift it, right? Will it be a change of heart? One day men wake up and say, okay, we're going to share the load. Or is it going to be some economic changes that will push women outside the home or near, basically into paid work, and that eventually will have a feedback loop and change norms. If you look at the evidence from the rest of the world, change of heart never led to change in social norms. I mean, in China went from foot binding to 80% labor force participation rate, not because somebody woke up and said, oh, that's a really bad practice, let's end it. That's not how it ended. And in no country has it ended that way. Basically, it's when economic opportunities have increased. And it's been tough to manage, initially, norms don't change overnight. So managing, accessing new economic opportunities with the earlier cultural norms has been difficult. But countries have transitioned through that difficulty into setting a new norm, right? And so I think those are lessons that I'm working on a paper where I'm comparing East Asia, particularly because I think East Asia has a lot of lessons for South Asia, because South Korea, had very strong son preference norms, and they still do, but it's much, much reduced. So, we have lessons to learn from East Asia about this. Now, here, for example, given the predominant responsibility of reproductive labor, if work is available, it is very far away. It doesn't help, right? So, how do we get the work to the women rather than to think of women to work? And I know that we are going to discuss that question later on in the panel discussion. But here, many people are starting different initiatives. So, for example, in Bombay, there's an initiative that's looking at bringing work to the neighborhood rather than expecting women to travel 4 hours in the local and then coming back and then also having to cook and clean and all of those things. So, I think we need to think of creative solutions to this issue. I'm not going into measurement. Okay. Just quickly, because this was the title that was announced earlier. So here now, this is my second paper, which is dropping out, being pushed out, etc. So this paper looks at the question of transitions in and out of the workforce. Because when we think of India, we think of LFP as an in and out story. Think of it as a binary variable, that either women are in the labor force and they remain there, or they're out of the labor force and they don't get in, basically. And the CMI data, there's a data set that allows us to follow the same women every 4 months, right? And if you look at that data, then you find that women's labor force participation rate is actually very volatile. And the CMI measurement of women's labor force participation is very strict. So they, in fact, generate the lowest labor force participation rate numbers compared to other data sets. But using their own very strict definition, not changing that, we find that what is an average 15% labor force participation rate, if you measure women who are in the labor force at least once in those 12 rounds of data, that's 44%. And social norms don't oscillate every 4 months. Conservative families don't become progressive and then relapse into being conservative in the next 4 months. So what is it that's happening here? And here, I want you to remember what I said earlier about social groups. Social groups that have the highest labor force participation rates, that have the lowest taboos on women working outside the home, also exhibit the greatest number of transitions. So this cannot be about culture, this cannot be about norms. It has to be about availability of work. And there's plenty of evidence to show declining availability of work in rural India, which is where this problem is really concentrated. So women work when they can work, when they get work. By work, I mean paid work, of course, because as we learned in the morning, women work 24/7. So that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about paid work, paid employment, right? And in this, we also actually look at demonetization. Because the data set that we have covers the period of demonetization. Demonetization led to a decline in employment both for men and for women, but the decline in employment for women was 2 percentage points lower. Higher. The decline was greater, 2 percentage points greater compared to men. So when there is an external shock, women suffer disproportionately more. I have another paper on COVID. First wave lockdown shows the same thing. And I think we really need to think about overall the ecosystem of employment, which is this widening gap between numbers of people in the working age group, the so-called demographic dividend, and the numbers of jobs that are created. So this gap is widening, and I think this is what we need to focus on. There are other papers that look at what has declined. Is it the decline in the proportion of economically active women, or is it decline in the number of hours that they work? And why does that matter? Because if you get into the nitty-gritty details of measurement, if the decline in the hours is too large, then these women get failed to be picked up as workers. And so there's a paper that compares 6 states in the 1998 time use survey data with the same 6 states in the 2019 data, and you find that hours of work declined both for men and women, which shows the employment crisis story, but much more for women. And so we believe that that's okay, so this is just a slide to show that there are other stylized facts about women as well here in India that don't, to my mind, don't fit the supply side narrative. And I think we need to pay attention to those. The same norms that supposedly prevent women from working don't prevent women from accessing higher education. And the women who come into higher educational institutions are typically not married, and the parents are more worried about them, their sort of purity, if I can use that word, etc. So time is up. And here is my last slide, which I won't read out, but just leave it up there for you.
Show of hands for questions. One here. Go ahead. Do you want to? Okay, this is your mic.
Thank you so much for the presentation. So the presentation that happened in the morning, which Aishwarya ma'am gave, and also what Mahua ma'am was saying, that economic growth may not necessarily lead to change in closing the gender gap or in women empowerment. I don't know if my question is correct, but I feel that we are saying something which is contrast to what they were saying in the morning. So let's say, you're saying that economic growth, or if opportunities are available for women, social norms may not be absolutely necessary or change, or they may not sort of close the gender gap, is what you're trying to say, if I'm understanding it correctly. If someone has to work in the space of gender, what will you tell them, that whether we have to provide them better economic opportunities or work opportunities, or should they work on changing the social norms first?
Let's take one more question, Ashwini.
Hi, I'm Nandana Sengupta. I'm an assistant professor at IIT Delhi's School of Public Policy. I think this is fascinating work. I'm really interested in questions of skills and education. And again, I think if you disaggregate education, right? So there's a lot of, if you look at the Aisha data, we know that the proportion of women in higher education is actually rising. And in fact, for a number of degrees, there's more than 50% female graduates. But I think the type of education matters as well, right? Because if it's a demand side story, then it's also kind of a question of demand for skills. And so I was wondering to what extent one can attribute it to the gender disparities in skilling amongst women. And I think this kind of also, a second question attached to that is, you mentioned the labor force participation rates are higher for SC/ST categories. But interestingly, when it comes to education, actually gender disparities are much more amongst SC/ST categories. So I think the question of intersectionality also becomes very interesting when you think of this supply of skills is kind of, I guess supply of skills would be related to demand for labor. So I guess I wanted you to comment on those two. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. On your very last question, if I had to just give one word advice, I would say employment opportunities. Focus on creating employment opportunities. Social norms will change, not easily. And I'm not saying zero interventions are required for. These days, my pet passion is to, talk about sharing domestic. I don't think reproductive labor should be a woman's responsibility. So wherever given a chance, I will make that plug. So yeah, I do want to work on creating an awareness on how reproductive labor should not only be a woman's responsibility. It's a household's responsibility, and every member of the household should share, men and women. So not that we abandon the social norms question, but my argument is that the main constraint is lack of opportunities, particularly in rural India. You think about a village, what are the opportunities available to women? They can be school teachers, they can be Asha Anganwadi workers, maybe if there's a bank or something, they can get some work there. Couple of beauty parlors, right? What else? Construction, right? So these are the typical sectors that employ women. A lot of the work that they do on family livelihood enterprises like fisheries, orchards, dairy, all of this is done by women, by the way. Poultry, livestock farmers are almost entirely women. But are they counted as livestock farmers? Do they get an income? Can they open a bank account as a livestock farmer? No, they cannot, because the business is owned by the family. So we need regulatory and structural normative changes there as well. Right? So I'm not making a 0-1 kind of an argument. But I'm saying that if you want to just focus on the very hard to change social norms, then we are missing the boat in some sense. And when we focus on violence, there's violence inside the home as well. Right? So domestic violence, I mean, how are we going to change that? And there are other countries that have very high levels of domestic violence, but also have high labor force participation rates. How does that work? So in the UK, 30% of women report being abused or assaulted by their intimate partner, yet labor force participation rate is high. So the link between the two is not as straightforward as we think it is often, right? So that's I don't know if I've answered your question. To your question, on education levels and labor force participation rates, actually there's a U shape. So the highest labor force participation rates are the illiterate women and the highly educated women. So people like, in IITs, Ashokas, etc. On the question of skill, that's a little bit of a different story altogether, because skilling refers to any level of education. And there, unfortunately, sometimes we take the stereotypical female roles related to reproductive labor, and a lot of female skilling is done along those lines, silai, kadhai, roti banana sikho and all that stuff. I mean, women, as they study more, their aspirations increase. So we have to think of a more gender-inclusive skilling program that doesn't slot women into the box of silai, kadhai, beauty parlor, and men into plumbers, electricians, etc. And so there's some work that we are doing as a part of the project where we are trying to shift women into the more remunerative sectors. But there are other constraints there which I'll talk about later on.